Hi everyone, I'm Kiki. Today we are going to demystify arts motion. So if you are like me who are very afraid of arts motion, I hope this lecture will be useful for you because we're going to talk about some basic concepts of arts and also some common debate topics that you will encounter in arts motion. Let's dive in. So I'm going to divide this lecture into three parts. First, I'm going to talk about the unique value of arts. So the first part is going to be useful for you if you want to prove the value or the importance of arts in your speeches. So that will be useful if you want to weigh your argument. Second, I will talk about different types of arts. So basically, there are a lot of arts in the status quo, right? What kind of arts that government should emphasize on, and what kind of arts that we as society should value over other will be covered in this section. The last one will be representation in arts. So how is a certain community or how is a particular culture being presented in arts? Is it fair? And what are the repercussions of that? All right. So let's talk about the first part. Is art uniquely valuable? Before we answer that question, let's first ask ourselves, what is art? So the short answer is art is everything, right? It is human activities that create visual, auditory, or performing artifacts. So the examples are painting, sculpture, architecture, music, film, dance, literature, graffiti, street art, performing arts, you name it. All of these are basically arts. So there are so many types of arts, and literally everyone can produce art and call themselves artists. So the question is, how do we evaluate arts? So there are basically three basic frameworks that you can use to evaluate arts. One is experimental value, second is aesthetic value, and third is the cognitive value. So let's first talk about the experimental value. So what is experimental value? So some people believe that the reason why arts is unique and art is valuable is because of the experience that it provides to the viewer, right? So for example, if you look at the religious art, right, you probably have a sense of smallness where you feel like the suffering that you are having right now is insignificant compared to the suffering that your God has suffered from, right? It also probably give you some kind of positive responses of emotion, for example, satisfaction or pleasant emotional responses. So this is the reason why art is, valuable. But of course, right, this framework is not perfect. There are a lot of ways for us to challenge the legitimacy and the wholesomeness of this framework. So the first challenge that we can have is, is this experimental value that is given by art itself inherently unique, right? And some people might say it's not unique because there are also other things that are not arts, but also have the ability to provide you these positive experimental value, right? For example, if you look at natural landscape, or if you do other things, like for example, eating, you might also have like positive reaction from that. So which means that the experimental value provided by art itself is not that unique, right? The second, way to challenge is on forgeries, right? If forgeries also give us similar responses, it also makes us happy. When I look at forgery, art stands forged, and I still feel very, I'm still, pleased by the techniques that I use. What makes forgeries necessarily less artistic? So these are the, two interesting challenges that we can ask when, discussing about the experimental value of arts. The second framework that we can use to evaluate arts is the aesthetic value of arts, right? So art is valuable because of its aesthetic quality, right? Because different artists have different preferences on how they want to produce their artwork. Even when we're talking about painting, there are different types of strokes, different types of techniques, different type of shades of color. So all of that will contribute to different outputs of art, and that itself is very pretty and makes people makes it just pleasing to look at it, right? So the implication of that is literally everyone can appreciate aesthetic quality even without appreciating the subject matter. So example is religious art, right? So you don't need to be Christian, but you can also enjoy, looking at the artifacts or the architecture of those, churches, because those are just very pretty, right? And second of all, it also means that good arts are not replicable, because if you keep looking at the same technique, same arts, you probably are no longer appalled by it. And also, if arts is enjoyed and appreciated because of aesthetic value, and that also kind of means that different artists will have their unique way of producing their own aesthetic quality. That means this is why it is not replicable. But as always, we can always, challenge the, wholesomeness of this, framework, right? The first way is accessibility, right? The problem with, aesthetic qualities, yes, it can be appreciated by everyone, but the definition of what is aesthetic itself is probably defined by the privilege. So that also boils down to the question whether or not we should only subsidize arts that is only understandable to the public. And the logic behind this motion is because, government funding is limited, government should, prioritize using the funding on, social goods, and oftentimes public don't really understand arts that have aesthetic qualities, because those definition and the metrics to evaluate whether an art has artistic qualities probably defined by the elite, right? But second of all, if we often, if we prioritize and emphasize on the aesthetic part of the arts, oftentimes that comes at a trade-off where we will, ignore, or we will put less effort or less resources on developing the, content. So one good example is Avatar, right? When there's a lot of money, a lot of like effort, time, being invested into the production of the aesthetic part of this, people probably don't spend that much time appreciating and trying to understand the storyline of the movie. Third way of challenging aesthetic qualities is how aesthetic quality is not a sufficient framework to really evaluate all types of arts, right? Because if you still remember, arts is basically everything. It's basic human activities that give you, auditory, any kind of sensory excitement, right? The problem with that is conceptual arts that usually, try to bring in a new idea or try to talk about a certain concept are not really aesthetic per se. So if we only use aesthetic framework to evaluate whether an art is valuable or not, we end up, ignoring there are other also good arts available. Okay? So the third way of us evaluating art is on the cognitive part of the arts, right? So art is valuable because of the idea and the message that it tries to convey. And the reason why this is unique is because art is communicative in nature, especially, and it's very effective in conveying an idea. And I would like to say that in fact, art is like kind of the most accessible way for us to communicate an idea. Because if you talk about like, writing an article to document the struggles of a minority, or, filming a documentary, those things are okay, but not a lot of people will have interest or time to, to really, sit down and read that article. And some people are probably illiterate to begin with, right? And this is what makes art unique, because you don't really need to be literate, you don't really need to be educated, and you can kind of understand the meaning of the art, and you are free to interpret whatever the meaning of the art, right, by yourself. So that also means that conceptual arts is generally public friendly, because it's open to your own interpretation based on your own experience, based on your own, identity, your background, etc. And that is why people tend to believe that conceptual arts is more accessible. But of course, there's like some room of debate here, because sometimes conceptual arts can be very, very abstract to the extent that people don't really understand what kind of message that it tries to carry, right? So what are the challenges that we can pose on cognitive value being the framework, right? First of all, it's just not holistic enough, because there are other arts that purely don't have cognitive value, right? For example, if you look at Van Gogh's Sunflower series, it's just, Van Gogh's flexing its different, different types of techniques, different, quality, different skills that he had. It wasn't really trying to carry a very deep meaning or any kind of message that discusses about the social issue, etc., right? But the second way for us to challenge is that there are other things that just also thought-provoking, right? For example, debate, research. Basically, these things will also make us talk about social issue. They will also make us, utilize our critical thinking, analytical skill to talk about, to think about things. It also asks us to explore, certain issues in the society. So those things are also thought-provoking. So that means that cognitive value itself is not really unique. It doesn't really, prove that an art itself is unique, right? So at this point, it just seems like there's no single framework that is perfect to evaluate what is a good art or not. So good, and a very short answer to what makes art unique and what makes a good art good is basically when an art has a combination of the above framework, right? If an art has aesthetic quality at the same time as cognitive value, that's probably a good art. It's an art that engages our emotion and makes us care about the message. It's the art that enriches our understanding of world by creating an imagined space and allow us to think about different kinds of life and worlds. All right. So now let's talk about the second part of the lecture, which is there one form of art that we should prioritize? As I said, right, there's so many types of arts that and society tend to have limited attention span, and government have limited funding as well. So what kind of art should we prioritize? In general. So I'm not going to cover all types of arts due to time constraint. So let's just quickly talk about the three basic one that we will usually encounter in tournaments. So first one is when art is used as a tool for activism. Second is arts that are curated by immoral, controversial artists. And third one is art that's created arts that are basically immoral or controversial. So let's talk about each of them. So some people argue that we should prioritize arts that are used for, that have that aim to talk about a certain social issue that's used for activism. Some people, there are also a lot of motion in tournaments where, this house believe that social movement should use art as the primary communicative tool, etc. So all of that kind of boil down to the idea that art is very good at conveying an idea. So if you want to prove that art is very useful here and therefore we should prioritize these type of arts, you want to talk about two things. First is reflection. Second is knowledge, right? So art is very good at reflecting the social issue or reflecting what society believes in, etc. So by using art as an activist tool, right? We can change the way society thinks about or discusses an issue. And then when people, talk about that, that is when you have awareness. And when people are aware of your movement, of your goal, that's when people will start joining your movement, they will start supporting your campaign, and they will start, voting for your cause. And that's how you create tangible change, i.e. policy change. And art is also important because even though it doesn't really create change, art as an activist tool is still very useful in expressing the struggles that minority have, in communicating to the public about the, how minority have been marginalized in the past, in documenting the struggles of those marginalized groups. So if you want to prove that this is important, you want to really, emphasize or characterize how these type of arts make our audiences feel and react, and how is that useful. So one good example is the poster, right? You can see the poster doesn't have, a lot of fancy design. It doesn't have, long ass, documents about what is exactly happening, but just very, very, simple art. It can carry a very, strong message about how if the government keeps the silence on AIDS issue, it's equivalent to murder. And that is very useful in conveying that idea. Right? So the second type of arts that that you probably will also face in debate tournaments is, what about arts that are curated by immoral or controversial artists? If these arts are good, but they are created by problematic people, should we as a society still allow those arts to thrive? Right? That's why we have motions like, individuals have an obligation to not consume artwork from artists that have committed highly immoral action. So to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves two questions. First is, should arts and artists be evaluated separately? So if you are the side where you think that no, they cannot be evaluated separately, you're basically saying that art is more personal than other ways of expression. It's not like just writing an article. It's not just like, you giving a debate speech, etc. A lot of times, the reason why an artist is able to draw or, produce such artwork is probably because of, an intersection of a lot of things, right? Maybe the artist have like very deep emotions, right? His own desire. So a lot of times the artwork itself is an extension of what the artist believe in. Is an extension of the artist's personality and also the belief system. So it's very hard to really, separate art and others. And second of all, it's also from public perception, right? Public generally just cannot separate them because we are so used to, seeing this artwork from the perspective of artists. So, it's very difficult for us to separate it. And when media, talk about an art, we also attach the story or the background of the artist together, which makes it very, very hard to separate. But if you're the team that believe that they can be evaluated separately, we probably want to talk about how a lot of times artwork is created out of because art is basically collaborative in nature, where, for example, if you look at drama and movies, it's not just the work of an actor or an actress, right? It's usually a collective work by a lot of people. For example, you have directors, script writers, staff behind the scene, you have different actors, different actresses. So a lot of time it is unfair for us to just ban this type of artwork just because of one man mistakes, right? So the second questions that we can ask ourselves is, should we excuse them simply because they're talented in this field? Again, this is debatable, right? If you think that we should not excuse them, then you're often saying that because the way we advocate our sympathy aligns with the power struggles within society. And that is why we should prioritize speaking needs over the artists. That is why we don't glorify Hitler's art, or that's why we oftentimes cancel arts or we don't support arts that are created by young, talented artists who did problematic things, for example, sexual harassment. And another benefit of not allowing these type of arts to exist is we create a tangible change within the art industry, because we are sending a message to this art industry that you are not excused just because you're talented. We are not gonna appreciate your arts. So that also will put influence or future deterrence on future artists, to be mindful of their own actions and behavior. So that to some extent can prevent future bad things from happening. All right, so now let's talk about the third types of arts, which is arts that are basically just offensive, depicting immoral things or just happen to be controversial. All right, so to answer this question, again, to discuss this motion, there are mainly two clashes. First is, how do we really tell something is offensive and controversial? And I think this is kind of the biggest clash here, because we are all from different background. We all have different religious different belief system, different cultural background, etc. So the things that I might find offensive might not be offensive to you at all. And we also have different tolerance. So I might, be insensitive and someone might be more sensitive towards a particular thing. So it's very difficult for us to objectively say that this art is offensive, right? So that's one problem with that, right? Who can define offensiveness? Second of all is, a lot of times, what makes something offensive or not is highly dependent on an individual, right? It kind of conflict with a part of the group or the community that we talk about. So when you're defining offensiveness or controversy around the arts, you need to be very, very specific. You need to be very detailed in characterizing which kind of community and which part of group that we are focusing on, right? So one good example is Charlie Hebdo's cartoons, right? So his cartoon might be offensive to religious followers, but might not be offensive at all to non-religious followers. Right, so the second, clash is, should we censor them or not, right? Because if you believe that we should censor them, you are basically saying that these arts created a lot of harms, and the amount of harms that these arts create, far, outweigh the benefits that it create. But if you're a team that believe that these art should still exist, you are basically saying that if we ban those art, we are basically losing the value for the society. Because if you still believe, because even if arts that are offensive, right, they might still have some, messages that you want to talk about, right? So when we ban those art, we're also losing that part of, positive value of the art. The second problem with that is you risk silencing people, right? Because oftentimes when you ban offensive art, you might also end up banning arts that are offensive towards the government, right? For example, that can be a useful tool for dictators to further silence on people by banning arts that are deemed offensive to them, right? For example, arts that challenge the regime, arts that try to question the legitimacy of these government might end up being banned. Right, so now let's talk about the last part, which is the representation in arts. So, to understand why representation in arts matter, there are basically few things that you need to know. First is media is a mirror to the society. So what the media portray is usually what society believe in. And that means two things, right? First, it affects how you form your identity, right? So if a young girl is, being told that, she has to be a mother or she cannot be a career woman since young, then, she will have that belief because she will have that belief and, shape her future towards that pathway, because that's basically what the noises or the voice around her has been telling her to do that. So it affects how a person form their own identity. It also affects how society perceive a particular identity of a certain group. Okay, so for example, why do certain why do we have stereotypes over certain communities? Is because we oftentimes because we get those information from media, right? So that means that if your if your pursuit or if whatever you want does not align with what the society believe in what you should do, oftentimes your self-worth and your worth will be undervalued and undermined, and that's not good, right? So that is why it matters, right? What kind, the way we depict a certain community or a particular gender or whatever, right, matters. That is why representation matters, right? So if, as I said, right, if a girl, is being told that, oh, a good girl, a good, this, being a housewife is like the best, or a noble job that the girl can do, then she will probably not question those things and just like accept the fate and just be, and just do it, right? Okay, so the second problem is whitewashing, right? So whitewashing basically means that you are using, like, for example, white actor or actresses for non-white roles, right? And the problem of that is you trade minority experience in favor of majority participation, and it also strip away minorities' agency to control and reclaim the troubling characterization of themselves, right? Because a lot of times, right, if you ask a white actor or actress to, cast in a non-white role, right? Because that white actor or actresses don't have actual experiences of the life, right? So they probably are gonna use like whatever information they've gotten or they think is the correct characterization. So that might, they might use like things like stereotypes, etc. In to cast those roles. So that's problematic. Okay, that's why we have motions such as, oh, this has believed that films should only cast actors from the same minority. So a good example of whitewashing is the World Trade Center, where the two protagonists were both white, although in real life, one should be African American man. Okay, so the reason why cultural appropriation or whitewashing matters and is something that we should care about is because if you still recall what I said just now, right? The reason why representation media matters is because it affects how you form your identity, and also it affects how society perceive your identity to be, right? So part of your identity comes from how people outside your group perceive you. In cultural appropriation, we have very little control over how such perception and how our identities are being defined. Okay? So in most cases, some group tends to pick up some characteristics, styles, music, and remove the cultural context to market. Right, so the impact of that is you lose context and cultural coded meaning, and it hurt people who feel attached to those culture. But, one way to, question this is on cultural essentialism, right? Where is it really true that one group can claim one form of art? Or should art be just enjoyed by anyone, regardless of their, culture or community, given the fact that, community or, race to some extent is also arbitrarily defined, right? Yeah, so the second impact is how it makes it more difficult for a marginalized group to create identities that empower them, especially when majority dominates the platforms and hijack the discourse. So when everyone believes in stereotype, right? So let's say because a particular white actor has portrayed a certain culture that way, right? And because it's popular, everyone believes in it. It makes it very difficult for a minority to come out and say, no, that's not us. We don't act that way. It is a form of stereotype because the discourse is likely to be hijacked, right? But another good impact is, positive impact, I guess, is that, when, the harsh reality is without capitalism, no one is really interested in talking about very, very minority culture or indigenous culture. Media doesn't really have incentive to report on those things because it doesn't really bring viewership. So to some, and capitalists don't really have incentive to invest in, firms, production, or anything that is just about, a minority if the ROI itself is not good, right? So to some extent, a lot of times capitalists use, cultural appropriation or whitewashing as a tool to secure some return on investment, right? By having a famous, white actor or actress to, be part of the production. That's how they can at least guarantee viewership. So, that's like it's not perfect, but a lot of times because of this, that's when people start, talking about those culture. And that's when culture gets success because you get number. Yeah, but obviously the trade-off is quality of message, right? Just because a lot of people now know about your culture, but if the culture is being, depicted in a distorted way, is it something that we still want? Okay, so that's basically the end of the lecture. So just a quick recap. We covered three things. So first, we talk about the three different framework for us to evaluate arts. Second, we talk about different types of arts and what kind of art should we prioritize over the other. And lastly, we talk about the representation in arts. Hope this is useful. Bye.